Hey, welcome to Hear God's Word. This is Michael Longer. In this podcast, we study and dissect the Bible to better understand what it means and is trying to say. We'll cover theology and dig into the original meaning through language and word studies. We'll even discuss scientific and historical ties, but we'll always come back to the basics. There's so many layers to the Bible, and it's all important. So, if you want to hear what God has to say, then let's dive in. Hey everyone. So today's episode, again, like I mentioned last time, is going to be a little bit shorter than most. And we're going to just cover 2 verses again. But the reason why this is a different episode is because you're supposed to pause after the last one because there's a section break. It actually is going to do something similar to what we talked about before with those section markers, but not only that, but with it even telling us that we're basically or reorienting the way that we're viewing the story. And it's about to start shifting our perspective. So we were talking about Cain's family tree and genealogies, and we're going to get into another one starting next episode. But we're going to focus on this seemingly repetitive theme of the Bible repeating itself. So the question is, why does it do it? Are the biblical authors just lazy, dumb? They didn't catch their mistakes, that they were writing the same thing over and contradicting what they said earlier? I would highly suggest no. And I recommend the Bible Project because they do a pretty good job going over the concept of how the biblical authors wrote. And at least from everything we know, and especially when you read the scriptures and look at the details, you see that the Jews had a way of writing that was very circular, repetitive, in the sense where they would take something that you've already heard and then frame it in a different light or look at it from a different angle. And all of the things that are being written are true at the same time, but in different ways. And we have a term for that called paradox. And some people jump straight to the conclusion that they think that the biblical authors are just making contradictions. But the same person who was writing chapter 1 was probably also working on chapter 5. So I'm pretty sure they didn't forget that they already wrote things that were previously written, especially in chapter 2 and part of chapter 1. So we're going to get into it and you'll see what I mean, where basically it's looping right back to the beginning with creation and the first people again. So, why are we going backwards? Well, let's let the Bible explain itself. So we're starting in Genesis 5:1 and just going till verse 2. So it says, "This is the record of the family line of Adam. When God created humankind, he made them in the likeness of God. He created them male and female. When they were created, he blessed them and named them humankind." So here we'll break this down, but you can see what I mean right away, where no, haven't we made some progress? Why are we going all the way back to Genesis 1:27 and that time frame, like all the way back to the beginning of Adam and Eve, or when it said God created male and female in his image. So we have this term again, and we had it earlier back all the way in chapter 2, verse 4. We had, this is the account of the heavens and the earth. And what do you know? Again, we have something very similar, basically almost the same. It says, this is the record. And that word for record is actually switched up, because when it says the record of the family line, and this is the net version again, the word record is basically a writing or a book, but then that word family line, believe it or not, is the same word for account. And I know it gets confusing because the term for basically generations or descendants can be translated a few different ways. Basically, the term in Hebrew indicates the people that are, or the story that is to come through a certain line of people. So basically, we have the creation generations or account, and we have basically the story beginning there. But now it's going back again. It says this is basically the writings or the book, even though there weren't books, so it was a scroll or possibly even tablets at earlier points. But they had these writings, and it was of the generations, because we're going to get some more generations we're going to talk about again. So is it going to pick up with Cain's family, or actually we haven't talked about Seth's yet. So maybe it'll talk about Seth's family. And I'll just give a little bit of a tip off to you guys right now that it's actually done talking about Cain's family tree for right now. And actually, it's not going to mention anyone else from it. So is that an indication that something bad might happen? You know, he obviously did wrong by killing his brother. And is God going to punish his family? And is Cain basically passing down a curse from one generation to the next? Like, is that their family story? Obviously, we'll have to keep reading and see. But I just wanted to point out how there was that abrupt stop, how we were talking about these descendants, and then we went into the story about Lamech, and then we cut out of his family story, and then we went into, well, you know, now we want to shift perspective over to Seth. And Seth had a kid named Enosh, and that's when people started calling on God. And we talked a little bit last week on that, but this is the thing that God wanted from people to begin with. He wanted Adam and Eve in the garden to call out to him instead of talking to themselves or the snake in the garden. If they would have gotten their mind on what God had to say, and if they would have called out to him, prayed to him, communicated in some way with God, then they, at least at that time, would not have gotten themselves in trouble. If Cain would have cried out to God and called to him or worshiped him by listening to God and not going down the route he did, he wouldn't have ended up in all of the same trouble that he did. And so we can pull out again for a minute. And so basically, we're talking about the record or the account of the generations and the family line, as it says in the net version, which I think is really good. And I like how in the New King James Version, it puts it this way. It says, "This is the book of the genealogy of Adam." And like we've talked about in the past, it seems like it's a proper name, but it also could indicate that this is the written record. And the Amplified Bible says it a different way. It says this is the book, the written record, the history of the generations or the descendants of Adam, which Adam is human or humanity. And you could see how when we were reading the Net Bible, it said that God created humankind. And obviously, that's synonymous and exactly the same thing as mankind, because mankind or Adam or man does not signify that it's just men, because if you read what it says, he created them. So he created the humans, male and female. And so now we're on verse 2. We talked about how God had made humans, and it's retelling from this point of the story for a second time because we had it restarting in chapter 2, verse 4, and now we have it again in chapter 5, the restarting of the story in a way, because as I was mentioning, we just went over Cain's story and this sort of history with specifically this account. But then I think that it's trying to tell us, which is why I broke this up into its own episode, even though it's going to be short, is I believe that they're trying to give us a hint that this is kind of like a new and separate line that is being painted here. And that's why they're retelling it. They're trying to subtly hint to us that even though God had obviously already made the world, and we talked about Cain and his descendants, and we're not literally time traveling and going back in time for like a second or third time. It's simply like a flashback, now cueing us into a different perspective. And we're going to, instead of following the timeline in this direction, it's going to be like, okay, so what if you're paying attention to these other things and we have the camera turned in a different direction while we go down the story? Like, instead of focusing on Cain, what if now that Seth is born and we have his sons calling on the name of the Lord, what if we pan the camera and focus on them? So that's essentially the best way that I think this can be described, why the Hebrew writers do this kind of repetitive thing. And obviously I'm making it longer and more repetitive than they do even. So if you just read straight through Genesis or you take your time, you'll probably get through it a lot faster than we're going through in this podcast. But obviously there's a lot to unpack and there's so many concepts. And once we get these things down, we can start moving a little faster in the future and tackling slightly bigger sections. But these are kind of new themes, but at the same time, they're repeated in a little bit of a different way. And so I wanted to make sure that you guys are understanding why, because a lot of people, when they come to this kind of stuff, they get confused or they begin to criticize the Bible right away as if it's unintelligently written, whereas it's actually very artfully written on the other hand. So, something that I really wanted to point out. And as I mentioned, I'll leave a link for the Bible Project in the description. So, God created the people in his likeness, and we talked about that. He created them male and female, which we've also talked about. And these are obviously huge things that it's trying to help us remember. And so the question, again is, so if God is focusing on the fact that he created male and female, like, is it talking about that he created several or many other males and females? Or is it just going back to the Adam and Eve story? And the answer is, I'm not 100%. And that's the difficult thing about the Bible, but also the very graceful thing about the Bible, because in one sense, it's not open to interpretation in the sense of they meant what they meant. But at the same time, a lot of times the authors would leave it open for the reader to spend time just thinking and digging. And sometimes I don't know if even the biblical authors had all the answers, so they were writing at least about the aspects that they did know. You know, by the time that they were recording this history, it's possible that maybe not all of the details of the beginning were preserved, so they were talking about the beginning to the best of their ability of what God revealed to them and helped clarify actually was true and did happen from the most reliable sources and streams of stories and information that had come to them several centuries later when they started writing and compiling the scriptures. And at least there's quite a bit of evidence that they did start writing on scrolls and tablets and making some notes on some of these things before in history. And then it was just later that all the stuff was compiled. But let's end off with one last thing. And that is the fact that we have another reminder pointing us back and alluding to something God said right after it's saying in Genesis 1:27 that God created humankind and made them in his image, male and female. It's basically almost a one-for-one repeat in Genesis 5:1 going into 2. And in verse 2, it talks about God blessing them. And if you look in 128, it says that God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply. So they're being fruitful and multiplying. So they're already at least obeying God with that. But obviously, it doesn't take much motivation for people to have sex and have kids. Comes pretty easy and naturally. So that part isn't that hard to convince humans to do that kind of stuff. But obeying God with other stuff that, we just don't see the same or have the same desires naturally to do. Sometimes it takes a little bit more will to listen to God and not be angry at someone or to not harm them when we're upset, or to disobey God when he's told us not to do something Adam and Eve ate from the tree and they didn't maybe understand all of the reasons why, and God didn't tell them all the reasons why, which is part of the reason why it's so hard for us. Why does God tell us not to have homosexual relations or relations with animals? Or why does he tell people not to even look at people lustfully? And there's lots of other ones that we can easily agree on, like murder, but also even things like having envy or covetousness, which basically wanting something that's not yours. Of course, we all have the inclination to not want to have our stuff taken, but then sometimes we're okay thinking or planning or letting our mind run wild on how we're going to try and get something that isn't ours to take. And it just circles back to the very first original sin and the reason why it was wrong for them. Same thing for us. And that's why God doesn't want us to do certain things, because it is not good for us and it's not good for the person that we take from, even if that person is in mutual agreement for both parties' harm, even though they think they're both benefiting. But again, just wrapping this up, is it's trying to point to the fact of how when God created people, he blessed them. And here it actually basically finishes the creation story, because people were the last thing that he made before he rested, right? So it says, well, pause again. Remember, after God would make things, he would name them. So technically, earlier, God had made the people, and he made them male and female, and he made them in his image and all of this stuff. However, it actually doesn't say what he called them. It just says what he made. And so it kind of is just begging for us to go back over the story again later on, like a time like now. And that's kind of what I'm getting at, is that was actually a pretty clever thing that they did, is really Adam and Eve and Cain and all these people, like, they've screwed up pretty bad in different ways. And in a way, the story started with them, but at the same time, like, they haven't really been the ones to start this full on good, very good project that God started with this world. And yet here, now that we're talking about Seth's line, like, it seems like there's something different about them, because we're going to go over his family line this next episode. So God names the humans, or the male and the females, human. And that's where this part leaves off, and it actually has another small section break. But right before, at the end of last chapter, it had a larger section break. So we're supposed to take a pause, and then after that, we're going to go, like I said, into the family tree of Seth and see where that takes us, because as I've been mentioning, usually the family trees actually lead to someone specific. So just keep that in mind, and keep it tucked away as we read and come to the end of the genealogy. I'll try to not say something right away, but as soon as we do, it should click and you'll realize where the genealogy leaves off. And you probably heard the name of the person that it ends on, at least in this account. And there's a very specific reason why. And so, yeah, genealogies are actually really great. And we've been talking about it for the last 3 episodes, in a sense, and we're going to have more coming in the future. So with that, we'll leave off here and take care, guys. Hey, I'm so glad you guys could join for today's podcast. I hope things clicked for you and that you're able to better understand God's word. Jesus said, "Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear." So keep on listening to what God has to say, and I'll see you guys next time. God bless.